It happened on a quiet Sunday evening, the kind that should have felt comforting after a long week, but instead hummed with a strange tension I couldn't name. I had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, basting the roast chicken the way Daniel used to love it, crisp on the outside, tender within, trying to recreate a fragment of the warmth our family once shared. The table was set with his favorite china, the one rimmed with fading blue flowers. I lit the candles he'd bought for our anniversary 3 years ago, and their glow softened the edges of the room. In my heart, I wanted this dinner to be a bridge, a small step toward mending what had been quietly breaking since Daniel's passing. I wanted Ethan, my stepson, to see that I was still here, still trying to hold the family together like his father would have wanted. When Ethan arrived, his footsteps echoed down the hall, confident, careless, as though this were his house alone. He greeted his sister Lily with an easy hug, nodded at me with the politeness of a stranger, and sank into the seat at the head of the table, Daniel's chair. My breath caught for a moment, but I said nothing. Grief rearranges households in strange ways, and I didn't want another argument. We bowed our heads for a brief prayer, and I dared to think, just for an instant, that maybe tonight would be different. The small talk began, Lily chatting about her new job, the gentle clinking of silverware, the faint hum of rain against the window. I remember smiling, feeling a fragile kind of hope stretch its wings. Then Ethan looked up from his plate, eyes sharp and unreadable, and everything inside me went still. He set down his fork with deliberate grace, wiped his mouth, and said in a tone so casual it almost sounded playful, "You know, Laura, maybe you should find another table. This one's for real family." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The words were so cruel, so absurdly childish that my mind refused to register them. But then he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking slightly as if he had delivered a clever joke. The laughter in the room died instantly. Lily's mouth fell open, my hand trembled, a piece of bread slipping from my fingers onto the plate. The air seemed to thicken. Even the rain outside paused, listening. I felt the sting rise behind my eyes, but I refused to let it fall. I had endured this kind of quiet cruelty for years, the sarcastic comments, the small exclusions, the deliberate reminders that I was merely a guest in my own home. But this was different. It wasn't just disrespect, it was dismissal, a public erasure of everything I'd tried to build. I looked at him and sought not the boy who used to chase fireflies in the garden while I clapped from the porch, but a grown man so consumed by resentment that he couldn't recognize love even when it stood right in front of him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, I placed my napkin beside my plate. "All right," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Maybe one day you'll understand what real family means, Ethan. I hope you do." His smirk faltered, but I didn't wait to see what came next. I rose from my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and walked toward the kitchen. The clatter of dishes and the whisper of my footsteps filled the silence he had created. My heart thudded painfully, but beneath the hurt, there was something else, something new. Not anger, not despair, resolve. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, staring at the flickering reflection of candlelight on the tiled wall. I thought of Daniel, his quiet laugh, his hand on mine, the way he'd say, "You have more strength in silence than most people have in noise." I realized then that silence could also be an answer, a kind of power. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and returned to the doorway. Ethan was still sitting there, pretending to eat, his fork scraping the plate too loudly. He didn't look up. I saw the flowers on the table. White lilies, Daniel's favorite. And for the first time, I felt no need to defend myself, no urge to win his approval. I whispered, mostly to myself, but loud enough for him to hear, then maybe you'll understand what family means once you've lost it twice. And with that, I walked away. The words weren't planned. They rose from somewhere deep and bruised, but strangely calm. I heard Lily's breath catch, a soft gasp that sounded like shame and sorrow mixed together. Behind me, the house felt suddenly enormous and empty, yet my chest felt lighter. I didn't know it then, but that single dinner, the one meant to heal us, would become the night that began to rebuild us instead. Sometimes a family has to break to remember how to hold on. To understand that dinner, you have to understand the history woven beneath every word Ethan spoke. Because hurt like that doesn't appear out of nowhere. It builds quietly, year by year, like a crack that deepens every time someone pretends not to notice. When I first met Daniel, I wasn't looking for love. I was 47, a widow still haunted by the smell of hospital antiseptic and the silence of an empty bed. He was 52, a widower who carried sadness like a shadow, polite, gentle, and slightly lost. We met at the library one spring afternoon when I dropped a stack of books and he bent down to help me. I remember his hands trembling slightly as he smiled. There was a calm in him that drew me in, like finding a still lake after years of storms. Our friendship grew slowly, the kind that doesn't need grand declarations. We shared coffee, stories of loss, laughter that surprised us both. For the first time in years, I felt seen again. When Daniel introduced me to his children, I wanted desperately to get it right. Lily, only 20 at the time, greeted me shyly but warmly. She had her father's gentle spirit and her mother's eyes. But Ethan, already 24 and living on his own, looked at me like I was an intruder in his family's history. He was polite, but every smile felt practiced. Every nice to meet you slightly forced. I understood. Losing a mother at 18 leaves wounds that time doesn't easily close. I told myself he just needed time, that once he saw how much I loved his father, he'd soften. I couldn't have been more wrong. In the beginning, the slights were subtle. He'd talk about Mom constantly at dinners, emphasizing how she used to cook Daniel's favorite meals, how she decorated the house, how she made Christmas magical. I'd nod and smile, genuinely interested, but the repetition felt pointed, like a reminder that I could never measure up. When Daniel proposed to me 2 years later, Ethan didn't attend the engagement dinner. He sent a text instead. "Hope you're happy, Dad. Guess we move on fast these days." Daniel brushed it off, saying he just misses his mother. But the truth was clear. Ethan wasn't mourning. He was building a wall. After we married, I moved into Daniel's house, a beautiful, old 2-story place overlooking a quiet lake. It had been their family home for decades. I changed very little out of respect. I kept the photos of his late wife on the walls, preserved her favorite garden roses, even used her recipes when I cooked. But instead of gratitude, it only seemed to deepen Ethan's resentment. Every visit became an interrogation. "So, redecorating already?" he'd asked. Glancing around, "Guess it's your place now." Or he'd mutter under his breath when I wasn't meant to hear, "At least Dad's eating again. Credit where it's due, I guess." The tone always carried that quiet poison that doesn't kill outright, it just wears you down. Still, Daniel loved his children fiercely. He never wanted confrontation. Whenever I brought up Ethan's behavior, he'd sigh and say, "He's still grieving, Laura. He'll come around if we're patient." And I believed him. So I cooked extra when Ethan visited. I made his favorite lemon pie. I remembered his birthday. I asked about his job, his friends, his dreams. Each effort was met with polite indifference, or worse, sarcasm. Once when I complimented his new suit, he smirked and said, "Trying a little hard to play mom, aren't we?" I laughed it off in front of Daniel, but that night, I cried quietly in the shower. What made it harder was Daniel's health beginning to falter. He brushed it off at first, shaky hands, fatigue, the occasional dizzy spill, But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I took care of him through every doctor visit, every blood test, every sleepless night. Ethan visited, but mostly to check in about practical matters, finances, wills, the house. He'd say things like, "Dad, make sure Laura's taken care of," but there was always an edge to it, as if he were warning me not to get too comfortable. I tried to believe he cared about his father's future, but it always came back to inheritance, ownership, control. And yet, through all of it, Daniel never stopped believing in family. He'd say, "We just need to give him love," resting his trembling hand over mine. Time heals anger. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe that love could rewrite resentment, that kindness could undo suspicion. But time doesn't always heal. Sometimes it hardens what's already broken. Looking back now, I see the irony. I had spent years trying to be part of a family that had already decided I didn't belong. Ethan didn't hate me because I was cruel or careless. He hated me because I was a reminder that life had gone on without his mother. Every smile from his father, every peaceful dinner, every laugh that echoed through the halls was proof that his mother's absence didn't end the world. And for him, that was betrayal. By the time Daniel's illness became serious, the wall between Ethan and I was a fortress. We lived under the same roof for months, moving around each other like ghosts. He'd nod when passing me in the hallway, his eyes sliding past mine. I'd leave dinner for him in the oven, and he'd eat it without ever saying thank you. It was a silent war fought with politeness. I told myself I could endure it for Daniel's sake, for love's sake. But deep inside, a part of me knew that something was brewing beneath that silence, waiting for the right moment to explode. I just didn't know that explosion would come in the form of 12 words spoken over a dinner table. "Go find another table. Only real family allowed." After that stormy dinner, the words "only real family allowed" kept echoing in my mind. But to truly understand their weight, I have to take you back to the promise that started it all. The promise I made to Daniel in his final days. It was late autumn, the kind of evening when the sun sinks quietly into the horizon, painting the sky in soft orange and gray. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine beside Daniel's bed. His illness had taken its toll. The man who once built furniture by hand now struggled to hold a glass of water. Yet his eyes still held warmth, that same steady kindness that had drawn to me years ago. I remember sitting beside him, holding his frail hand in mine, trying to memorize the pattern of the veins on his skin, the rise and fall of his chest. He turned his head slowly and whispered, "Laura, when I'm gone, promise me you'll stay strong. Promise me you'll take care of yourself and the kids." His voice cracked on that last part. I wanted to tell him the truth, that his son barely tolerated me, that I felt like a stranger in my own home. But I couldn't. His eyes were filled with such desperate hope that I nodded through my tears. "I promise you, Daniel, I'll take care of them." He smiled faintly, but there was something else in that smile. Fear. "Ethan means well," he said after a pause, as if trying to convince himself. "He's stubborn, but his heart is good. You just have to give him time." I squeezed his hand tighter, unable to tell him what I already knew. Ethan's heart had built a wall that even time couldn't reach. Still, I gave him my word, because that's what love does. It keeps promises, even when they hurt. The following weeks were a blur of hospital visits, hospice care, and quiet tears in the middle of the night. I watched the man I loved fade away piece by piece, his laughter softening into silence. And through it all, Ethan remained distant. He'd visit, yes, but only for brief moments, 15, 20 minutes at most. His conversations with his father were stiff, like two men discussing business instead of love.
Once, I walked into the room to find Ethan going through Daniel's desk drawers. When I asked what he was looking for, he said, "Dad told me to handle his affairs. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're comfortable." His tone stung. Comfortable, as if I were a guest who had overstayed my welcome. When Daniel passed, the house felt like a hollow shell. The day after the funeral, the silence was unbearable. No soft humming of his voice, no clinking of his tea mug, no footsteps in the hallway. Just me, a widow again, surrounded by memories that didn't quite belong to me. I tried to grieve quietly, but grief has a way of finding cracks to pour itself through. Every time I looked at Ethan, I saw a reflection of Daniel, his walk, his frown, even the way he adjusted his watch. But unlike Daniel, his eyes were cold. Then came the matter of the will. The lawyer arrived a week after the funeral. Ethan sat across the table, arms crossed, jaw tight, like someone bracing for battle. The reading was simple. Daniel had left the house and a modest inheritance to me, and an equal share of his remaining assets to both children. Fair, balanced, just as Daniel had always been. But Ethan's reaction was anything but. He leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile scraping across his face. "So you got the house. Figures." I tried to speak, to tell him I didn't care about the money or the property, that I'd trade it all just to have his father back. But he walked out before I could finish. For months afterwards, we barely spoke. He came by only to collect his father's tools, old fishing gear, photo albums, everything that had belonged to Daniel before me. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. Every time he left, the house felt emptier, like he was taking parts of Daniel with him. But still, I kept my promise. I sent him messages on holidays, invited him for dinner, asked about his life. No response. And yet, one evening, almost 6 months later, he called. "Dad's birthday's coming up," he said flatly. "Lily and I are planning a family dinner. You should come." My heart leapt. Maybe this was it. Maybe the wall was finally cracking. I spent the entire day preparing his father's favorite dishes: roast lamb, mashed potatoes, lemon pie. I set the table with Daniel's old silverware and lit candles just the way he liked them. I even placed a photo of him on the mantel, smiling. For the first time since his death, the house felt alive again. When Ethan arrived, he looked different, calmer maybe. He brought flowers, though he didn't say who they were for. We ate quietly at first, sharing stories about Daniel. Even Ethan smiled once or twice. I thought, this is healing. But as the evening went on, something in his tone shifted. The jokes turned sharp, the laughter faded. And then, as I reached for another plate, he leaned back and said those 12 words that shattered everything I had built. "Go find another table. Only real family allowed." Everyone froze. Even Lily's smile disappeared. I sat there, stunned, my hand trembling as I set the plate down. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rest. Ethan looked at me not with anger, but with finality, as if he were closing a door. In that moment, I remembered my promise to Daniel and realized how impossible it had become. But promises have strange power. That night, after I left the table in silence, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I sat in the dark living room beside Daniel's photo and whispered, "I'll still keep my word, no matter how much it hurts." Because even though Ethan had broken my heart, I knew that Daniel's last gift, his faith in family, was still worth protecting. And somehow I had to find a way to do that, even if it meant forgiving the unforgivable. The night after that dinner, the house felt heavier than ever before, as though Daniel's absence had returned to haunt every corner. I sat on the couch in silence, staring at the cold remains of the evening,
untouched plates, half-melted candles, and the framed photo of Daniel smiling faintly from the mantel. The laughter that had once filled this house was gone, replaced by the echo of Ethan's cruel words, "Only real family allowed." I repeated them to myself until they started to lose meaning, until they became just sounds, hollow and sharp. But pain has a way of reshaping itself into clarity, and as I sat there alone, I realized something Daniel had once told me. Sometimes people don't need punishment, Laura. They need truth. The next morning, I opened Daniel's study, a room I hadn't entered since the funeral. His scent still lingered in the air, that mix of cedarwood and old books. I began sorting through his belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. That's when I found it, a sealed white envelope tucked inside one of his journals, with my name written in his careful handwriting. My breath caught. It wasn't the first letter he had written to me. Daniel was always sentimental, but this one felt different. He had written it only a week before he passed. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter that would change everything. My dearest Laura, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I know you're probably sitting in the study trying to tidy up my old mess. Don't. Leave the mess for a day. Sit down, read. I need you to know something I never had the courage to say in front of the children. I've made mistakes, not just as a husband, but as a father. I let guilt control me after their mother died. I tried so hard to honor her memory that I stopped letting anyone else have a place in mine. You've been patient, more than anyone had the right to ask. Ethan, he's angry at the world, not at you. But I also know he will hurt you if you let him. So please, don't let him. There's something else I've left for you, not just the house, but something I never told the children, the lake cabin. It's in your name. I bought it 2 years ago intending it to be our retirement escape, but I never registered it under mine for a reason. I wanted you to have something that was only yours, untouched by my past or theirs. If Ethan ever questions your place, remind him that love is not inherited, it's chosen. You were my choice, Laura. My peace, my family. Love always, Daniel. I read the letter 3 times before it truly sunk in. The lake cabin, in my name. I remembered Daniel mentioning it once, but I thought it was just a dream he never followed through on. My hands shook as I looked through his files, and there it was, the property deed legally signed and dated, registered to Laura Henderson. My heart swelled with grief and pride all at once. He had known this storm was coming. He had prepared for it. And suddenly, I understood what I had to do. Not for revenge, not to prove Ethan wrong, but to show him that love, real love, leaves behind more than just inheritance. It leaves legacy. A week later, I invited Ethan and Lily over again. My heart raced the entire morning, wondering if he'd even show up. But when the doorbell rang, there he was. Guarded, cold, arms crossed, the same defensiveness in his eyes. Lily, as always, stood beside him, awkward but kind. I just want to talk, I said, gesturing toward the dining table. No drama, just talk. Ethan hesitated, but eventually sat down. I slid the envelope across the table, the same one Daniel had left me. Your father wrote this before he died, I said quietly. You should read it. His eyes narrowed. What is this? Another will, another way to guilt-trip me. His words were laced with bitterness, but I didn't flinch. I just nodded toward the letter. Just read it. As he unfolded the paper, I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes at his father's handwriting. He began reading aloud softly, his voice trembling slightly.
At first, his expression was skeptical, almost irritated, but as he continued, the words started sinking in. His shoulders loosened. His eyes began to shine. When he reached the line, "You were my choice, Laura. My peace, my family," he stopped. His jaw tightened, but his voice broke anyway. He folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, and stared at it for a long moment. "Why didn't he tell us?" he finally asked, his voice small. "Because he didn't want you to see me as someone who replaced your mother. He wanted you to see me as someone who chose to love you, all of you, even when you made it hard." For the first time, Ethan didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with confusion, with something that resembled guilt. "I thought you just wanted his money," he muttered. I don't know what I thought." I smiled sadly. "You thought you were protecting him, but you were protecting a ghost, Ethan, not your father. He didn't need protection. He needed peace." The room was silent. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't have a comeback. Lily reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad was right. He always said you had the kindest heart." Ethan looked away, but I saw the truth flicker in his eyes, the understanding that love, loyalty, and loss aren't competitions to be won, they're bridges to be rebuilt. That day didn't fix everything. He didn't suddenly call me mom or hug me goodbye, but when he left, he paused at the door and said quietly, "Thanks for showing me the letter." It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall, a beginning. And that's when I realized that Daniel's last letter wasn't just for me. It was for us. It was his way of saying that even after death, love could still heal the living.
2 weeks after that conversation, I decided to visit the lake cabin Daniel had mentioned in his letter. For months, I had avoided going there, maybe because part of me was afraid it would make his absence more real. But now, after everything that had happened, I felt drawn to it, as if the place itself was waiting for me. The drive was long and quiet, the road winding through golden trees that shimmered in the early morning sun. It felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that carries memory instead of emptiness. When I finally arrived, the sight took my breath away. The cabin was small, nestled beside a mirror-still lake surrounded by tall pines. The air smelled of damp wood and pine needles, and the faint sound of water lapping against the dock made my chest ache with nostalgia. It was beautiful, simple, untouched, and peaceful, just like Daniel had described it on the nights when he would dream out loud. I stepped inside and instantly felt his presence everywhere. His jacket hung neatly on a hook by the door. His favorite fishing hat rested on the shelf above the fireplace. On the wooden table sat an old notebook, open to a half-finished sketch of the lake. His handwriting underneath read, "Someday, this will be our forever." My eyes blurred with tears as I traced the words with my fingers. He had planned this place for us, a refuge from the world, a home where time could slow down. But now, it was just me. For a while, I sat on the dock, my feet dangling over the water, watching the ripples spread outward like thoughts I couldn't contain. That letter had changed everything between Ethan and me, but it hadn't healed everything. His guilt was there, I could see it. But guilt isn't the same as forgiveness. And forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something I had to wait for. It was something I had to give. Not just to him, but to myself. I had carried years of pain, rejection, resentment, loneliness, and somehow I needed to let it go. As I sat there lost in thought, I heard a car approaching. For a moment, I froze, thinking I must be imagining things. But when I turned, I saw Ethan's car pulling up the gravel path. He stepped out slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, looking awkwardly soft but determined. My heart skipped. He had come.
Lily told me you were coming here, he said, his voice awkwardly soft. I figured I should check the place out. Dad used to talk about it. I smiled faintly and gestured toward the cabin. He left it for me, but it was meant for all of us, a place for peace. You're welcome to see it. We walked inside together. He didn't say much at first, just looked around quietly, touching things as if they were relics. He paused by the notebook, his eyes lingering on Daniel's handwriting. He really did love you, he said after a long silence. You can tell. It's all over this place. I felt my throat tighten. He did. But he loved you more. You and Lily. You were his whole world. He shook his head slightly, his jaw clenching. I didn't deserve that. I was horrible to him near the end. I kept pushing him about the will, about money. I thought he was being manipulated. I thought I was protecting him. I laughed bitterly. Turns out, I was just protecting my pride. I walked over and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. Grief makes fools of us all, I said softly. You weren't trying to hurt him. You were trying to keep a part of him from slipping away. Ethan's eyes glistened. But I hurt you. And he saw it. He must have been disappointed. I shook my head. He wasn't disappointed. He was sad. There's a difference. He knew you loved him. He just wanted you to love without fear. For the first time, Ethan met my eyes without flinching. There was no anger there anymore, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much guilt for too long. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for that night, for every cruel thing I said, for every time I made you feel like you didn't belong. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. You don't have to say that, I whispered. Yes, I do, he said firmly, because you did belong. You loved him the way he deserved to be loved, and I see that now. He looked around again, his voice softening. This place, it's part of his love story, and I guess that means it's part of mine too. We stood there for a while, surrounded by silence and memory. It wasn't the grand reconciliation you see in movies. No dramatic hugs, no swelling music. Just two broken people quietly acknowledging the truth that love leaves behind. Later, as the sun dipped low over the lake, Ethan helped me light a small fire in the stone pit outside. We sat side by side, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames dance. He told me stories about his mother, how she used to sing while she cooked, how she could never stay angry for long. And for the first time, I told him stories about Daniel, the way he hummed in his sleep, how he always left the porch light on for me when I came home late. Somewhere between laughter and tears, we realized something simple yet profound. We didn't have to compete for Daniel's love. We both carried it, just in different ways. When Ethan finally stood to leave, he looked back at the cabin and said quietly, "You're right. It feels peaceful here. Maybe I'll come by again sometime, if that's okay." I smiled through my tears. It's what your father would have wanted. As his car disappeared down the road, I turned back toward the lake, the stars beginning to shimmer above the water. The grief was still there. It probably always would be. But for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt gentle, like the lake breeze. That night, I whispered into the quiet air, "Thank you, Daniel. You kept your promise. You brought us back together."
Forgiveness doesn't come with fireworks or grand moments. It comes quietly, in fragments. A text here, a call there, a softened tone that wasn't there before. In the weeks following our time at the lake cabin, I began to notice those small changes with Ethan. He didn't suddenly transform into a doting son, but the frost in his voice melted little by little. It started with small gestures, a message asking how I was doing, a random visit to fix the squeaky kitchen door, a box of his father's old books left on the porch with a note that simply said, "Thought you'd want these." Each act was like a puzzle piece slowly forming a picture of something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. One Saturday morning, he called. The sound of his voice, calm, almost hesitant, made my heart skip. "Hey, Laura," he began, using my name instead of the cold "you" I have grown used to. "I'm heading to the cemetery. Thought you might want to come." It was simple, almost casual, but to me, it meant everything. We hadn't gone together since the funeral. That day, as I stood beside him at Daniel's grave, I realized how far we had both come from that dinner table moment. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you speak softly even when you're alone. Ethan placed fresh lilies on the gravestone, Daniel's favorite flower, while I brushed away a few leaves that had gathered near the inscription. The words carved into the stone still made my throat tighten. Beloved husband, devoted father, and eternal peacemaker. I smiled faintly at that last part. Even in death, Daniel was still healing us. "I've been coming here every week," Ethan said after a long pause. "At first, I just sat here, angry. Angry that he left, angry that you were still here, angry at everything. But lately I've started talking to him." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I probably sound insane." I smiled. "No, you sound human." He looked at me then, eyes clear but vulnerable. "You know what I tell him? I tell him I get it now. I get why he loved you. You didn't try to replace anyone. You just loved him quietly, the way he needed. And I made it harder for you." My chest tightened with emotion. "Ethan, I never expected you to understand right away. You lost your mother, then your father found someone new. That kind of change doesn't come easy." He sighed deeply, his breath fogging in the cool morning air. "Mom was my whole world, and when she died, I built this idea that loving anyone else would be betrayal. When Dad married you, I thought he was forgetting her. But now I see he wasn't replacing her. He was surviving her." I felt tears well up, not from sadness, but from the beauty of his words. "He survived because of you too, Ethan. Even when you were distant, he never stopped loving you. You were his pride." He smiled faintly. "He told me once that family isn't about blood. It's about who stays when things fall apart. I guess I didn't really understand that until now." We stood there in silence for a while, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and flowers. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for Daniel this time, but for Ethan, for his healing, for his peace. When I opened them again, I saw him watching me with a softness I hadn't seen before. Afterward, we went to a small diner nearby, the same one Daniel and I used to visit on lazy Sunday mornings. The waitress recognized me immediately. "Haven't seen you in a while, sweetheart," she said with a smile. "You bringing your husband's boy today?" Ethan smiled politely, and I nodded. Something like that. Over pancakes and coffee, we talked for hours, not about death or guilt, but about life, about Lily's new job, about Ethan's recent promotion, about the weather, the neighborhood, the silly things that make ordinary days worth living. For the first time, the conversation didn't feel forced. It flowed naturally, like the river beside the lake cabin. At one point, Ethan glanced out the window and said, "You know, Dad would have loved this. Us sitting here. No tension, just peace." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Then he turned to me, his expression earnest. "I want to start over, Laura. Not because I owe you, but because I want to. You deserve better than the way I treated you." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "And you deserve peace, Ethan. We both do." That afternoon, he helped me fix the broken gate at the house. We worked side by side in comfortable silence. Every hammer strike felt like a symbol, a rebuilding of something broken long before I arrived. When we were done, he looked around and said with a quiet smile, "It finally feels like home again."
Later that evening, after he left, I stood by the window watching the last light fade. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel too big or too empty. It felt warm again. Daniel's presence lingered, not as a haunting, but as a blessing. I whispered into the air, "You were right, my love. Time didn't heal anger. Forgiveness did." And just like that, I realized forgiveness wasn't a gift I was giving Ethan. It was a freedom I was giving myself. That night I slept peacefully, dreaming of Daniel by the lake, smiling. Not because the story was perfect, but because the pain had finally found purpose.
Spring came early that year, and with it came a new kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. The frost that once covered my life, and Ethan's, had finally melted. Our relationship didn't transform overnight, but piece by piece, it grew into something strong, fragile, and real. It started with small visits, then shared errands, then Sunday dinners that became a new ritual. The first time Ethan walked through my door without hesitation, I felt a lump rise in my throat. He didn't wait on the porch or linger in his car anymore. This time he came in carrying a tray of lasagna, joking, "Don't worry, Laura, I didn't cook it. Lily did." I laughed so hard I nearly cried. It was such a simple gesture, yet it meant the world. That evening, I decided to recreate something Daniel had loved: family dinner night. I set the table carefully, every detail thoughtful. The linen napkins Daniel had gifted me on our anniversary, the candles he once said made any meal feel sacred, the old wooden bowl that used to hold his favorite salad. When Ethan and Lily arrived, the house was filled with the comforting smell of garlic bread and rosemary chicken. For the first time in years, the clinking of plates and laughter didn't sound like echoes of the past. They were music for the present. During dinner, Ethan brought up stories about his father. Some were funny, some emotional. "Remember how Dad used to sneak extra gravy when Mom wasn't looking?" he said, chuckling. "He used to wink at me like we shared some top secret mission." I smiled, picturing it vividly. Lily added, "He did that even when I cooked. Guess it was his thing." We all laughed. For the first time, we were sharing memories without pain, without comparison, without ghosts. Halfway through the meal, I noticed Ethan glancing at me, not with the cold distance he once had, but with something gentler, almost protective. He cleared his throat and said, "I used to hate these family dinners. They made me feel like an outsider in my own home. But tonight," he paused, eyes glistening, "tonight feels right." I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I reached for his hand across the table. He didn't pull away. Lily smiled quietly, understanding the weight of that moment. For so long, I had been the outsider too, the woman who married into grief, who tried too hard and was met with walls. But now, sitting there, I realized the walls had finally crumbled. Not through confrontation, but through patience and love. After dinner, we stepped out into the backyard. The stars were bright, scattered like silver dust across the dark sky. Ethan leaned on the railing, exhaling deeply. "I never told you this, but I always blamed you for Dad's death. I thought your presence made him forget about Mom, and somehow that guilt killed him faster. But now I see how wrong I was. He was happy, Laura. You made him happy. I just didn't want to see it." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "Ethan," I whispered, "you were grieving. You lost both of your parents in a way, one to death, the other to time. It's okay that you were angry, but I'm grateful you're here now. That's all that matters." He nodded, his face illuminated by the porch light. "Dad always said love wasn't about who started the fire, but who kept it burning. You did that, even after he was gone." That night, when they left, Ethan hugged me. Not a polite, hesitant hug, a real one, the kind that says, "I'm home." I stood there long after the door closed,
overwhelmed by the quiet peace that settled in my chest. Days turned into weeks, and our bond continued to grow. Ethan started dropping by more often, sometimes to fix things, sometimes just to talk. Lily began joining me for morning walks. We even started a small garden together, planting the same kind of lilies Daniel once grew. One afternoon, Ethan called out, "You know, we should make this a tradition. Dad would have loved seeing us all like this." I smiled. "He probably is seeing us," I said softly. By the end of that summer, something miraculous had happened. Our fractured family had rebuilt itself without realizing it. We didn't erase the past, we learned to live alongside it. The ghost that once haunted us had turned into gentle reminders of love's endurance. When Ethan invited me to his new home for dinner, I almost couldn't believe it. He said, "It's not fancy," he laughed, "but it's ours." As I walked through his front door, I saw a picture of Daniel on the mantle, and beside it, one of all of us at the lake cabin smiling. I froze, touched beyond words. He found that old photo in Dad's things, thought it belonged somewhere everyone could see it. In that moment, I realized this was more than forgiveness. It was rebirth, a family reborn from the ashes of misunderstanding and loss. Not perfect, but stronger than before. Before I left that night, Ethan said, "You know, Dad always said that real family isn't about who shares your blood, it's about who shares your heart. I think I finally understand that." And as I hugged him goodbye, I whispered, "So do I." That night, as I drove home under a sky full of stars, I knew Daniel's greatest wish had come true, not through him, but through the love he left behind.
After that night at Ethan's new home, when laughter replaced the echo of resentment, I found myself drawn to an old wooden chest tucked away in my attic. Inside it lay pieces of a life that once felt too heavy to touch: Daniel's journals, family photos, and at the very bottom, an envelope I had sealed but never mailed. The handwriting on it was trembling but neat, written during those final weeks of his illness. It was addressed to Ethan. I remembered sitting at Daniel's bedside, him too weak to hold a pen, dictating his words in whispers that broke my heart. I never had the courage to give it to his son, afraid it might reopen wounds rather than heal them. But now, after all this time, I wondered if perhaps it was finally the right moment. I sat by the window, the letter trembling in my hands. Outside, the first rain of autumn had begun, soft and cleansing, like the world was washing away its old sorrows. With a deep breath, I unfolded the paper, and Daniel's words came alive again. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to say this in person. I need you to know that love doesn't replace love, it expands it. When I met Laura, I wasn't looking for another version of your mother. I was simply trying to learn how to breathe again. She didn't erase your mom's memory. She helped me carry it with peace. Son, don't close your heart to the people who tried to love you. You'll only be hurting yourself." My tears blurred the ink. Daniel had always been a man of few words, but every one he wrote carried the weight of truth. The letter continued, "Take care of Laura when I'm gone. She's stronger than she looks, but even the strongest hearts need kindness." I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the ache of every year we had lost in silence. Ethan had grown up thinking I'd stolen something from him, when in truth, I had only ever tried to protect the love his father left behind. That evening, I decided. The next morning, I baked Daniel's favorite apple pie, not as a peace offering, but as a symbol of continuity. When Ethan arrived for our usual Sunday visit, I asked him to sit with me on the porch. The sun was setting, spilling golden light across the garden, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain. I handed him the letter without a word. His brows furrowed as he looked at the envelope, his name written in Daniel's familiar script. "Where did you get this?" he asked, a voice low. "Your father dictated it to me.
I never gave it to you because I wasn't sure you were ready. He stared at me, stunned. Then slowly, he broke the seal. I watched his eyes move across the lines, saw the shift in his expression, disbelief, pain, regret, love, each emotion flickering like light through glass. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence between us wasn't cold anymore. It was full, like a shared heartbeat. Finally, he whispered, I thought he chose you over us. I thought you made him forget Mom. But this? He loved you for helping him remember her without breaking. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Daniel had always been a man of few words, but every one he wrote carried the weight of truth. The letter continued, Take care of Laura when I'm gone. She's stronger than she looks, but even the strongest hearts need kindness. I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the ache of every year we had lost in silence. Ethan had grown up thinking I'd stolen something from him, when in truth, I had only ever tried to protect the love his father left behind. That evening, I decided. The next morning, I baked Daniel's favorite apple pie, not as a peace offering, but as a symbol of continuity. When Ethan arrived for our usual Sunday visit, I asked him to sit with me on the porch. The sun was setting, spilling golden light across the garden, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain. I handed him the letter without a word. His brows furrowed as he looked at the envelope, his name written in Daniel's familiar script. Where did you get this? He asked, voice low. Your father dictated it to me. I never gave it to you because I wasn't sure you were ready. He stared at me, stunned. Then slowly, he broke the seal. I watched his eyes move across the lines, saw this shift in his expression, this belief, pain, regret, love, each emotion flickering like light through glass. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence between us wasn't cold anymore. It was full, like a shared heartbeat. Finally, he whispered, I thought he chose you over us. I thought you made him forget Mom. But this? He loved you for helping him remember her without breaking. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Daniel had always been a man of few words, but every one he wrote carried the weight of truth. The letter continued, Take care of Laura when I'm gone. She's stronger than she looks, but even the strongest hearts need kindness. I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the ache of every year we had lost in silence. You carried his love through silence. You waited for me to feel safe, as you knew I would. I know, I brought heartbreak to you. He reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. For a moment, I saw Daniel in him, the same warmth, the same strength hiding behind his quiet eyes. The world around us seemed to slow. Even the wind fell silent, as if listening. Then he said something I'd waited years to hear. You're family, Laura. You always were. In that instant, the years of pain, misunderstanding, and loneliness dissolved like mist in the morning sun. We sat there until the stars appeared, talking about everything and nothing. Daniel, Lily, life, the future. When Ethan left that night, he hugged me again, this time whispering, Thank you for keeping his love alive. After he drove away, I stayed on the porch, the letter resting in my lap. I realized then that I didn't just hold Daniel's words. I held the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new. I walked back inside, lit one of the candles from our wedding, and placed the letter beside his photo. The flame flickered softly, and I smiled through my tears. Daniel once said that real love doesn't end with death. It transforms into the light that guides those left behind. That night, as I watched the candle burn, I finally understood what he meant. The bitterness that had haunted our home was gone. In its place was peace, the kind that doesn't shout, but hums quietly in the background of every healed heart.
A full year passed after that night on the porch, the night Ethan read his father's letter, and everything quietly changed. It wasn't a perfect year. It was a real one, full of healing, rebuilding, and rediscovery. For the first time since Daniel's death, life began to flow again. The grief that used to choke the air in my house had softened into a kind of sacred silence. The rooms no longer felt haunted, they simply remembered. Ethan and Lily became regular visitors, filling the house with laughter, teasing, and small acts of kindness that once seemed impossible. I found myself waking up in the mornings to text from Ethan, making coffee, thought of you and Dad's obsession with burnt toast. Simple, ordinary words, but each one felt like a thread stitching our hearts back together. Sundays became our family's day again. Sometimes we cooked together, sometimes we didn't cook at all and just ordered pizza, eating straight from the box while reminiscing about Daniel's awful attempts at making lasagna. We even took a small trip that summer, back to the lake house where Daniel had proposed to me. The last time we had all been there, Ethan barely spoke a word to me. This time, he insisted on driving. The journey felt like a lifetime, folded into a few hours. I caught him glancing at me in the rearview mirror several times, a faint smile tugging at his lips. When we arrived, the air smelled of pine and lake water, and the old dock was still standing, weathered but strong, much like us. Ethan helped unpack the car, and as the sun dipped below the waterline, he turned to me and said, "I used to think coming here without Dad would feel wrong, but somehow it feels like he's still here." I smiled, placing a hand over his. "That's because he is, just in a different way now." We spent the night by the fire, sharing stories that didn't hurt anymore. The flames flickered on Ethan's face, and for the first time I saw peace instead of guilt. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the lake, the still water reflecting the moon. I thought about Daniel, his voice, his kindness, his ability to love quietly and deeply. I whispered, "We're okay now, love. You'd be proud." And for a moment, I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder, warm and steady. In the months that followed, Ethan began stopping by even without a reason, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help fix something, sometimes just to sit and talk. One day he brought a small box. "Dad wanted you to have this," he said. Inside was Daniel's old wristwatch, silver, slightly scratched, still ticking. My throat tightened. "He wore this every day," I murmured. Ethan nodded. "He told me once, 'When this stops, it means my time's done, but make sure someone keeps it ticking.'" I smiled through tears and fastened it around my wrist. "Then I'll keep it going," I said softly. It wasn't just our relationship that healed. Ethan himself began to change in ways that made my heart ache with pride. He proposed to his longtime girlfriend Clara that autumn. When he called to tell me, his voice was shaking with excitement. Clara said in the background, "We want you to come dress shopping with us. You're part of this family, Laura. Don't even try to argue." I couldn't stop the tears that came after that call. Once I was the woman they didn't want at their table. Now I was being asked to help plan the next chapter of their lives. The wedding came the following spring. It was held in a small garden surrounded by blooming lilacs and soft light. As I watched Ethan waiting at the altar, adjusting his tie nervously, I saw Daniel's spirit shining through him, in his posture, in his gentle smile. When the ceremony ended and they walked down the aisle, Ethan suddenly stopped midway, turned around, and called out, "Laura, come here." Confused, I walked toward him as the guests looked on. He took my hand and said loudly, "You're the reason I got here. You taught me what family really means." My tears fell freely, and when he hugged me, the entire garden erupted in applause. Later that night, as music filled the air and laughter echoed, Lily came to me with a glass of champagne. "He's changed, hasn't he?" she said softly. "Completely," I replied.
And so have I. She smiled, squeezing my hand. Dad would have loved this. All of it. I nodded, looking up at the night sky. I think he does. After the wedding, Ethan and Clara moved into a new home nearby. Every Sunday dinner continued, the tradition Daniel unknowingly started and that I had fought so hard to preserve. Only now, it wasn't just me holding it together. It was all of us. Each plate, each laugh, each shared story became a stitch in a new kind of family quilt, one made from pain, forgiveness, and love. Sometimes when I'm alone in the evenings, I still talk to Daniel. I tell him about our dinners, about Ethan's jokes, about the way peace has finally found a home here. The ache of missing him never truly leaves. But it no longer hurts. It hums, quietly, like background music to a life that continues. And whenever I glance at his old watch ticking on my wrist, I remember his words. Real love doesn't end, it just changes hands. Watching Ethan laugh across the dinner table now, I know that's true.
A year later, almost to the day of that fateful dinner that tore us apart, I found myself standing in the same dining room, the one where Ethan had once told me to find another table. But this time, the scene was different. The walls were freshly painted a soft cream color. Sunlight poured through the curtains, and the table, that old oak piece that had once witnessed so much pain, was set for a celebration. Ethan and Clara had announced that they were expecting their first child, and they wanted the family to gather here, in the same house that once carried only echoes of sorrow. When I looked at that table, I didn't see rejection anymore. I saw redemption, growth, and love that had survived every storm. The house smelled of roasted herbs and warm bread. Laughter spilled from the kitchen where Lily and Claire were arguing over whose recipe for mashed potatoes was better. Ethan stood beside me, carving the roast, his face glowing with the quiet joy of a man who'd made peace with his past. "Hard to believe, huh?" he said softly. "A year ago, this room was filled with silence." I smiled, brushing a tear from my cheek. "Now it's full of life, just like your father always wanted." When everyone gathered around the table, I couldn't help but feel the weight of memory pressing gently against my heart. Daniel's chair was still at the head, though unoccupied. We kept it that way, not as a symbol of loss, but of presence, a reminder that love doesn't leave, it lingers. Ethan noticed my gaze and quietly said, "He'd want you to sit there, Laura." The room fell silent. For a moment, I hesitated. The same hesitation that had rolled my life for so long. Then I nodded and took the seat. It felt like a circle closing, like the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Ethan lifted his glass. "To family," he said. "The real kind. The one you fight for, forgive, and choose again every day." Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time, the words "real family" didn't sting. They felt right. I looked around the table, Lily's bright laughter, Clara's glowing face, Ethan's eyes shimmering with emotion, and realized this was the family Daniel had always believed we could be. Imperfect, human, whole. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Clara placed an old photo album on the coffee table, Daniel's, the one filled with our lives together. "I think our baby should know their grandpa," she said, smiling. Ethan sat beside her, flipping through the pages carefully. When he reached a picture of Daniel and me on our wedding day, he touched the edge of the photograph with his fingertips and said softly, "You made him happy. I see it now, in every picture, every look." I swallowed hard, my throat thick with emotion. He made me brave. And somehow he made sure we'd all find our way back here. As the night went on, the house grew quieter. The candles flickered and the sound of crickets filled the air. I stepped outside for a moment, standing beneath the stars. The garden we'd planted,
The lilies, the roses, even Daniel's old oak sapling had bloomed beautifully. I could almost hear his voice in the wind. You did it, Laura. You brought them home. My eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad. They were soft, grateful tears, healing tears. Ethan joined me outside, carrying 2 cups of tea. You know, he said, handing me one, I've been thinking about that night, the one I told you to find another table. He looked down, ashamed but calm. It's the memory that used to haunt me the most. But now I think about it differently. That was the night we broke, so we could rebuild. I nodded slowly. Sometimes things have to fall apart, Ethan, so they can fall into place. He smiled faintly. I guess that's what Dad meant when he said pain can be a teacher. I laughed softly. He was right, as always. We stood in silence for a while, watching the stars shimmer above us. Then Ethan said, when my child grows up, I want them to know you, not as my stepmother, but as their grandmother, the woman who taught me that love is something you keep choosing even when it hurts. I felt my heart swell in a way words could never describe. Then I'll make sure they know their father learned how to love twice as hard because he learned how to forgive. Inside, the others began calling us for dessert, and as we walked back toward the house, Ethan stopped me at the door. Laura, he said softly, thank you for staying, even when I pushed you away. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the angry young man from before, but a son who had finally found peace. I didn't stay because I had to, I said. I stayed because that's what family does. We stepped inside together, and as I looked at everyone gathered around that once painful table, I realized something beautiful. Love had outlasted the bitterness, outlived the pain, and rewritten our story. The table that once divided us now held us together. And somewhere, in that quiet, candlelit room, I knew Daniel was smiling. His family, our family, had finally found their way home.